Dr. Kristen Burton here. I am the Teacher Programs and Curriculum Specialist at the National World War II Museum. And I'm here to introduce our special guest who is joining us again for the second day, as Kate said, the Curator of Education from the National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, Laura Voigt, here to talk to us about the Treaty of Versailles and the failures of peace.
Yeah.
Laura?
Excellent. Thank you so much. It is a real pleasure to be back. We love to work with the National World War II Museum. There is so much that connects these two wars, and we're really excited to be continuing the conversation today. And then we look forward to more conversations as we look throughout the summer and explore all of these kind of enduring impacts of World War I. And our conversation today about the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference is clearly one of the biggest. And we will just be scraping the surface in our fast conversation today. Let me very quickly introduce you to the National World War I Museum and Memorial. We are located in Kansas City. That is actually the 27 acres that you would be able to explore if you were able to come to our site. We're really excited that we actually are going to be opening on June 1st. So if you find yourself traveling through Kansas City, do please join us. We actually opened in 1926, where then President Calvin Coolidge spoke to the largest crowd any president had spoken to up until that date. This was a major global moment, both the dedication and the actual opening of the memorial of the war to end all wars. And I do use that term intentionally in this particular phone call. We've got some lovely exterior buildings which were originally intended to be both a museum and a meeting space. Part of the idea behind this memorial is how can you create just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And in creating a community hall, it allows a place for people to come together and to learn and to connect. And that is the joy of virtual programs, my friends. It's live and delightful. The interior was reopened in 2006. You can see just a portion of the things. And if you want to actually explore it, go to theworldwar.org.online, and you will have the opportunity to take a couple of virtual tours through our space and explore more things like no man's land and the horrors of the war and the reasons why the war began, because we're not going to be talking about those today. There's a lot of stuff on the website. Please feel free. We've got some oral histories online, part of that audio archive as well. But the mission of the space itself is to remember, interpret, and understand the Great War and its enduring impact on the global community. Again, Paris Peace Conference really is one of those wonderful starting spaces to understand just how deep the impact is, how World War I really is this foundation of the 20th and the 21st centuries. So the Central Powers. Now, the Central Powers in World War I, they're made up of Germany, Austro-Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. It finally crumbles under the load of war in 1918. And at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the Armistice began on the Western Front. Now, when we talk about the Armistice on the Western Front, don't be mistaken. There's actually Americans who are still in Russia, and there is still fighting going on in different spaces. So I do really need to put that in there as a part of that caveat. But on the very first day that we have this pause in fighting, there's this just breath that so much of the globe is able to take. And there was a great deal of celebration, particularly around Europe. Now, Dr. Michael Nyberg, who is a great friend of both of our museums, said this: we must accept the basic truth that there's no document, even if thoughtfully written, that no document, even if thoughtfully written and elegantly implemented, could have closed the Pandora's box that Europe opened in 1914. Georges Clemenceau says, yes, we have won the war, and not without difficulty, but now we're going to have to win the peace, and that will perhaps be even more difficult. And the Paris Peace Conference began on January 18th of 1919. Now that very specific date is actually the anniversary of the coronation of the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm I, and it occurred in the Palace of Versailles in 1871. That's where Kaiser Wilhelm was crowned. So you can see where there are these sort of interconnections. And for many, they also still have the memories of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871, right? Half a century later. That is where, at the end of it, Alsace-Lorraine, a portion of France, went to, from France to Germany in some particularly harsh terms. Now, already at the conference, it was seen as basically an act of vengeance. You can tell how much of a vengeance. I mean, there are some people who are really wailing about this thing. Now, some people did imagine that these very specific dates were created to remind people why they were fighting in the first place. Now, Versailles itself, that's this beautiful, extravagant space. It's on the outskirts of Paris, and that's where the negotiations for the peace began. It was an enterprise that critics saw as flawed from the very beginning because neither Russia nor Germany were invited to join. Most of this conference was actually hosted in Paris. Now, Paris, right, it's the traditional capital of diplomacy. It's this symbolic reward for the French. It's also where the British feared it would become a bit of a place where everybody was going to be airing their grievances, right? You've got a whole variety of people who are all in Paris at the same time. All of these different people who had been fighting and the like. You have 6 different continents involved in this particular war. As a matter of fact, Ho Chi Minh, who was, right, who we all know from later years, he was there hoping to get an audience for which he was actually denied. So you've got all of these different people who are all in Paris at this period of time. And there are so many who are just engaging in the effort. You can see how this is going to become kind of unwieldy from the very beginning. Now, officially, the conference is going to last until 1920, but those first 6 months are really the ones that count. It's when the key decisions are going to be taken. It's the crucial chain of events that get set into motion. And the formal peace process ultimately is going to continue all the way through July 23rd, when the Treaty of Lausanne is signed. That actually means that all of this peace process for the World War is going to take longer than the fighting itself. Now, one last bit of information. The conference and the Treaty of Versailles are not synonymous, although they're referred to in that way many times. The Treaty of Versailles, it's kind of the star, it's the show, the showcase, because it kind of ostensibly ends the war. But Germany signs with the major Allied forces, not the Armistice, it's the treaty. The Armistice kind of says we're going to put down our weapons. And the treaty itself was signed on June 28th of 1919. That's going to be 5 years to the day that Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, as well as Sophie Chotek, who was Franz Ferdinand's wife. Now, many who were deeply involved in the conference knew that it was going to have issues early on. Pretty significantly, they knew that there were going to be these economic problems. You've got Herbert Hoover, who is responsible, if you've read Grapes of Wrath, you might think that he's responsible for the Great Depression, but if you were just living through the World War, you would think that he was responsible for the greatest humanitarian effort that had ever occurred. So he really did understand economics. There's an irony there that he gets that he gets blamed for the Depression. Economist Keynes, he too sees and starts to say this is not going to really work out that well. But ultimately, Woodrow Wilson, who does not take any Republican representatives with him, and that's going to be a really key thing, doesn't listen to a lot of other people, doesn't kind of engage other folks who have different strengths and intellectual backgrounds. And he really puts all of his eggs into one particular basket. And I'll tell you more about that here in just a second. But before we do that, we've got to look at Woodrow Wilson's senior advisor on the Middle East, William Westerman, who said this on the Treaty of Versailles. It's kind of wrong in spirit and quite wrong in its methods, really, even just as we're beginning. Now, for the first time in history, an American president, right, for the most part, the United States was kind of on the outskirts. We weren't seen as a major player on the global stage. An American president helped guide diplomacy. Now, President Woodrow Wilson is going to really reiterate this plan that he had laid out in January of 1918. And it's in every US history textbook, right? It's one of the few things most people remember from World War I. It is called the 14-Point Plan for Peace. Among his goals in that were self-determination for ethnic populations formerly ruled by the defeated imperial powers, and the creation of the League of Nations, an international forum for the maintenance of long-term peace in the world. You can see Woodrow Wilson was really considered a hero in World War I. If you still go and see the Arc de Triomphe today, there's a Wilson Street as one of those legs shooting out from that kind of center star that the Arc de Triomphe takes. If you look around to so many nations in the world, you'll actually find either a Woodrow Wilson Street or a Wilson Street in honor of him. And really specifically in honor of this idea, self-determination, that peoples should be able to decide who leads them. The greatest challenge to this is that it wasn't really articulated much further than that. Dr. Margaret Macmillan said, the expectations of the Paris Peace Conference were enormous, the risk of disappointment correspondingly great. The world has never seen anything quite like it and never will again. Can you imagine everybody on this call, if you were provided this idea that you should have the right to determine a bit of your own fate? And you know that all of the people who are here right now, and thank you guys so much for joining us, and all of the different locations and life experiences that you've had, you knew that it would be really difficult to come to any sort of conclusion. Some of you would actually be at odds. And if there's no clear articulation how to do that, some of you, if you went into this thinking, I get to determine what's going to happen for me and the people I care about, you can see how this idea of self-determination, which is a wonderful one, and we're able to put into play in better ways later on in the 20th century, how it can really lead to great disappointment if it's not followed through with. You go in with these grand hopes, and then in the end, if you receive something significantly less than that, it can lead to some really deep, hard feelings. And not only does it lead to hard feelings, it actually leads to continued conflict in Europe and in Asia, and sets the seeds for what happens in World War II. The world itself was completely fragmented by war. So from the former Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires, they'd all dissolved. You had these new states that were emerging, and they also wanted this independence and wanted to have a voice as a stakeholder. At the exact same time, they had all of these old ethnic rivalries that continued to undermine the peace. One of the things, and if you are a teacher here on the call or recently in a classroom, you may remember that adage, right? If there are straight lines on a map, it's most likely that someone who is not close to that space, some guys in some other room far away, actually determined where the borders and boundaries were. And just lines on a map don't always show that ethnic communities and the like. Russia itself is going to be reeling from the chaos of the Bolshevik Revolution. Great Britain is going to have a commitment to a Jewish national home in Palestine. You have this Balfour Declaration that begins during World War I. And it, alongside kind of some contradictory assurances to the Palestinian Arabs, which is going to set the stage for continuing conflict in the Middle East. And you have China and Japan, who are going to, though they had both been on, right, they've both been kind of on the Allied side, renewed ancient disputes over territory in the Far East. Many times people forget that Japan and the United States were on the same side of the war in World War I. And if you want a really piece of delicious historic irony, or maybe not so much irony, it is on December 7th, I think it's December 7th, Japan declared, December 6th, pardon me, declared the war, declared that they were going to take part in the war of World War I. So all of these different conflicts are happening. You can see how they're basically going to be set up for failure in many ways. Dr. Michael Neibert also said this: if we are to understand diplomacy, decolonization, the Second World War, and the 20th century more generally, there's no better place to begin than with the First World War and the treaty that tried to end it. In the examples that I just shared, you already see where these tensions are going to be leading us. And there's so much more that we could be going into. And I'm going to show you a couple of really fast books. If you are interested in more on what is happening in the Middle East, right? There's a really great book called A Peace to End All Peace. Notice we can't do that in 15 minutes by David Fromkin. That really goes into a lot of the specifics. I've also given a lot of specifics about the different nationalities. There is another book which is not on my lap right now by Margaret Macmillan called Paris 1919, and there is no better book to really begin looking at. Another great one is This Beauty by Leonard Smith, called Sovereignty at the Paris Peace Conference. All of these can really allow you to dig in a little more deeply. All right, again, President Wilson and Premier Juncker, the Champs-Élysées, Wilson. Here's the text of the 14 points in and of themselves. We're gonna go to, right, we've got number 13 right there, the creation of an independent Polish state. We've got the creation of the League of Nations. There are 12 others that you can read right there. French territories are going to be given back, that the people of Austria-Hungary, basically it boils it all down to self-determination, give people the lands kind of that they want, let them make some different choices. If you want to find out more about that, go to our website at theworldwar.org. And some really, you can see just in the, if you take a real close look at this image, the diversity of people around that table. Really for the first time, so many people from around the world in one space, and all leveraging and kind of jockeying for power at the same time. The Treaty of Versailles and others to come out of the conference were more lenient than those imposed by Germany on Russia, right? That's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which took away a lot of the major territories from Russia. There was this idea that if Germany had won, that they would have imposed these really serious, harsh terms. And so some are going to say that's part of the reason why they put such heavy, very specifically, financial burdens on Germany. It's also the first example of a peace conference where that combatant nation, where Germany wasn't invited. They were, there was this idea that they would always hope to, that they kept pushing it off, that they were going to invite them around the table, and that never actually happened. Instead, you have all of these people who are meeting, right, Ho Chi Minh, who are airing their grievances, deciding what they think should happen, in many ways jockeying for the things that will help their own nations. We've got the Council of Four, or the Big Four: Orlando, Georges, Clemenceau, and Wilson. And at the end, you have Germany provided with this one treaty and no opportunity to push back. There's no semblance of negotiation as it is going, as it's kind of ending ending the war. There's an argument that World War I never officially ends. That is another conversation for another time. Lastly, so that I can actually shift over, treaty is decided, and the United States simply does not agree to it. Woodrow Wilson left the United States for 6 months plus, does so in a very partisan manner, doesn't bring anyone from the opposing US political party. And so when he brings the treaty to end our involvement in the war back to the United States, we do not sign it. And when we do not sign it, the one thing that he had wanted to actually, that he'd given everything else up for, all of these other ideas, all of these other hopes, was the League of Nations. And the United States was not involved in the concept. Well, we were very involved in the concept. We weren't involved in the actual organization. I'll show you, there we go. I'm gonna actually, just for the place of time, treaty was actually signed June 28, 1919. And I am, and when they did, the war was not actually yet at peace, right? You have German-occupied northern France and Belgium that were still kind of laying in waste. In Germany's homeland, the Germans are still starving. Their resources had been spent on the war. Their ports were still being blocked by the British fleet. Hunger, along with, if you think about the border of Germany, you've got this Bolshevik threat of political revolution. And it's gonna really prompt German leaders because of this idea that there's gonna be revolution and you've got people starving at home. German leaders accepted the harsh terms in the treaty because they had no way to negotiate. And it's this particular treaty that's actually gonna later breed a lot of vengeance, which is something that Kristen can be talking to in very short order. Now the Germans are going to sign the Treaty of Versailles along with the European allies, though Germany was at first barred really from the joining the League of Nations. The United States Congress, they refused to join. They never ratified the treaty. Negotiations for all war-torn nations continued for more than 4.5 years. And the allies are going to separate the Ottoman Empire into French and British controlled mandates and some small independent states. That's going to come back around to us later on in the 20th century. In the Pacific and in Africa, the Allies are going to divvy up German colonies. And when they give what becomes Rwanda to Belgium leadership, that you can't help but note that it is that change that ultimately kind of sets the stage for the Rwandan genocide and those divisions, those ethnic divisions, which are put more heavily into place by the Belgians. It really is this foundation for so much of the conflict that happens in the 20th and the 21st century. the world was not actually at peace. And for some who experienced all this great loss and trauma, making peace with this war required a lifetime. And for some, it just wasn't possible. With that not being possible, is a really good kind of transition, Kristen. Over to you.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Laura. And you mentioned that wonderful quote by Dr. Michael Nyberg about how you can't understand World War II or why World War II happened without looking at the First World War. And in many ways, they are two parts of the same conflict because so many things tie them together. And that's why I'm really glad we were able to get these discussions going between the two museums to share with all interested parties as well as teachers and students. But you mentioned the Treaty of Versailles and the harsh conditions imposed on Germany specifically. And that's because Germany took the blame for World War I. Even though Germany technically didn't start World War I, not at all. But they were such prominent aggressors in the eyes of the victors. So when the treaty discussion comes about, and as Laura very clearly laid out, Germany had nothing to work with. They had no leverage in these discussions. And as a result, they received a pretty bitter pill in what was the Treaty of Versailles. And just to give you some sort of, some numbers to kind of shake this up, we always talk about reparations that Germany had to pay as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And essentially, Germany was required to pay 132 billion gold marks. At the time, that was the equivalent of 33 billion US dollars. Today, that's around $269 billion. That was something Germany had absolutely no means of being able to pay, not at all. And in fact, they did pay off the reparations and they completed their final payment in 2010. So it took them over 90 years to meet that requirement of the Treaty of Versailles. Germany did pay it off. It just took the bulk of the 20th century and then a small little into the 21st century. So it took over 90 years for them to meet that requirement of the treaty. And it was an absolutely devastating outcome for Germany. Keep in mind, when they went into World War I, they were a formidable military power. They had an expanding empire, and 2 decades into the 20th century, they had nothing. Their empire was dissolved. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne. Their monarchy was transitioned into a republic, the Weimar Republic, which had not nearly as much centralized power, which spawned a lot of discontent. And there's kind of a famous image, if you've ever encountered this when talking about how little value the German mark had following the end of World War I. There's these images of people with wheelbarrows full of German marks. And it was commonly said that an entire wheelbarrow of marks was needed to buy a loaf of bread. Roughly 4 billion German marks was the equivalent of $1 American dollar. So all of these factors played into deep-seated anger. And there was a fragment of the German population that was incredibly upset with the outcome of World War I. They were very proud of the strong German military might that their empire once had, and it was completely blown up. And those dissatisfied World War I veterans who fought for Germany became the base of those first stormtroopers and rallied around another World War I veteran, Adolf Hitler. And that's where we see these ties now come in between these two wars. So again, World War II doesn't happen without this prior conflict. Now, I just want to very quickly showcase some of the materials that the museum offers, some of the educational materials that we offer that can help you if you are a teacher or if you're a student to both teach or understand this evolution from the conflict that came before and the start of World War II, because World War II didn't come out of nowhere, as we've established today. If anyone is not familiar, I'm going to share my screen and briefly show you all. We have, get that up there. This is our classroom website offered by the National World War II Museum. And on this website, we have a number of different curriculum volumes that cover each theater of the war. And today I want to showcase the second volume, War in Europe. And in this curriculum kit, you can find lesson plans as well as essays that detail the entirety of the European theater of the war, but specifically we have some educational resources that show how these things came to be. So these overview essays are accessible whether you have a login or not, and you can look at these essays. They're about 1,500 words, 1,000 to 1,500 words. So they're short readings you can assign to students if you are a teacher, and they just give you brief overviews. And in this one, focusing specifically on how Hitler happened, you can find some of those pieces of information that I just shared. Also ties back to a lot of what Laura just discussed about how World War I and the aftermath of the conflict and the failures of the Treaty of Versailles led to the rise of someone like Adolf Hitler, right? So these educational materials are free to use and access. If you're a teacher, all you have to do is create a login, and you can see that this is how short the essays are, right? So to access all these materials, you can log in, and then once you do, you have your own, there will be a link called My Classroom. You can save any essays, lesson plans. There's also oral histories, interactive maps, and other educational materials you can use to teach about this transition from World War I to World War II, as well as other aspects of World War II itself. And you can save them to your classroom and access them easily at any point. If anyone does have any questions about that, I'm happy to answer any questions, as this is what I like to, or this is what I specifically work with regarding the museum. But that's it in a nutshell. I don't want to get into the weeds too much about the different curriculum offerings. And if any teachers are interested, I'm happy to discuss further. I'll share my email in the chat, and feel free to reach out anytime. But as Laura so clearly stated, you can't understand World War II or how it came to be without looking at the prior conflict, the failures of the Treaty of Versailles, and the deeply felt anger that came out of that peace treaty negotiation amongst the German people. So there you go.
So I'm going to start by answering one of the questions, and would encourage everybody to, if you have questions and you're on the Zoom portion of the call, you can go down and take a look where it says Q&A and go ahead and begin typing in the questions. We've already got some really great ones, so I'm not sure we'll be able to get to all of them. If you are watching us on Facebook Live, feel free to type that into the Facebook Live section, and we can see, and we'll be able to take some from there as well. Shannon asked a great question. Would you also recommend The Wilsonian Moment by Erez Manella for good information on the nation's fight for post-war self-determination? Yes, absolutely. And that's a really good point of 2 more books. That is one of them. And one of the things that Erez really advocates for is that we really shouldn't be saying that World War I is, I think in some textbooks, you're going to see it being listed as 1914 to 1918, because 1918 is the Armistice. There are other places that look at it from 1914 to 1919. It just continues to expand. You already know that some of those other treaties don't really happen until, you know, in the mid-20s there. So absolutely, highly suggest that work. it also kind of pivots what a lot of some former thinking might be on the matter. If you don't have a ton of time, another book that I also really suggest is this guy, Treaty of Versailles. It is a very short introduction. Teachers, if you're looking for a book to have folks read, this is just a really nice, light Oxford Press piece that's pretty easy to digest. Michelle asks, Woodrow Wilson traveled the country trying to get support for the League of Nations. Yes, he was trying to, he traveled the country to try to get support for the ratification of the treaty. Part of why it failed, according to some historians, right, there are 4,000 new books written on World War I in 2014 alone. So I won't be speaking for every scholar who's out there, but some would say that it was in part because of Woodrow Wilson's failing health. He had, and again, you've got a lot of really great biographies out there. Scott Berg has done a really nice biography on Woodrow Wilson. And a variety of folks would say that Wilson was actually having a series of small strokes during the Paris Peace Conference itself. And by the time he comes back, he is absolutely worn out health-wise. And so then is physically kind of incapacitated from completing what he had wanted to do and doing kind of this big rally around the nation. You might look at some other historians who would say that we already had our first female president with Woodrow Wilson's wife acting in his behest during the end of his presidency. But that is another story for another day. Michelle, thanks for a really great question. Linda Jansen, it's so great to see you here. How long did the British blockade of Germany last? It lasted through 1919. Ethan asks, you both mentioned that the Treaty of Versailles was forced upon Germany. Did the Weimar Republic ignore or refuse to abide by any requirements of the treaty? And Kristen, I would think that's a great question for you.
Well, again, keep in mind, the Weimar Republic was created as a result, essentially, of the collapse of the monarchy. And with the creation of the Weimar Republic, and let's look at the United States as an example of this. When you first start to form a new government, it doesn't always work. The Articles of Confederation, I think, is an excellent example of this. It's not something you can immediately put together and things are going to work very, very well. The Weimar Republic was a kind of hastily formed democracy, a republic, where it's an attempt at this, but this is also a people who traditionally were used to more of a monarchical society or form of government. So that being said, like, sorry, Laura, what were you gonna say?
Oh no, I'm just smiling. You guys, these are really great questions. So.
I thought you had something to add in.
No.
So, yeah, so the Weimar Republic essentially didn't have the teeth if there were people within the Weimar Republic who disagreed with components of the Treaty of Versailles, and there were, they lacked the power to formally ignore, not follow through, because they just didn't have the power with which to oppose it in a significant way. So people did attack it. People did argue against certain elements of it. But what could Germany do? They didn't have the economic ability. Their entire military was disarmed. Their ability to industrialize was halted. And everything about the status of Germany at that time was weak. So as much as certain people within the Republic might have wished to oppose the Treaty of Versailles, they simply didn't have the means or ability to do so. I think it's on mute.
Alrighty, so I'm going to run through a couple of these questions very quickly because there are some really nice ones, and there are some that are very, very quick. Neil, a good friend, asked the question, what was the name of that book by Dr. Macmillan? And that is Paris, 1919. Next, the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, but Hitler came to power in 1933. How important would you say it was to Hitler's rise to power? Kristen.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Hitler, the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, but Hitler came to power in 1933. How important would you say it was to Hitler's rise to power?
It's absolutely intrinsic because, again, Hitler was a veteran of World War I. He, if I remember right, requested to fight on the front lines. I mean, he was a strong proponent of the German military and German power. So in the aftermath of the war, he was deeply angry, dissatisfied, along with several other World War I veterans in Germany, about their humiliation. They suffered a deep humiliation with World War I. Again, as I said before, at the turn of the 20th century, Germany was an incredibly powerful, growing empire. Their military was incredibly strong. 2 decades into the new century, and they were completely in pieces. They didn't even have a military in the aftermath of World War I. They weren't allowed to have one as a part of the Treaty of Versailles. So Hitler was incredibly upset, and he specifically attacked the Weimar Republic for its lack of power and their lack of ability to stand up to the Treaty of Versailles. He then blamed the weakness of the Republic, of course, on Jews in Germany, and then used that racism to fuel his own agenda. And it was through that shared discontent amongst Hitler and other World War I veterans in Germany that allowed them to band together, and then they used that shared discontent to form a new party, the Nazi Party. And from there, they're veterans of a war, so through that military experience, they were able to create their own private army, the stormtroopers, and that is how they slowly began to consolidate increasing levels of power. They attempt to overthrow the government with the beer hall push that puts Hitler in jail because it fails. And in jail, he writes his manifesto, right? So all of these things are intricately tied together, but it all stems from this anger and discontent that came from the humiliation following the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles.
Tim Knapp asked the question, Wilson seemed to be forward thinking with the 14 points. Why did he not take any Republicans with him to the peace conference? Great question, Tim. And one that I think we can look back in history, and really the question that you're asking is, how is it that leaders aren't able to create or invest in support on both parties? Is really the heart of the question. And if I had that answer, the world would be a different place. There's some nuance, and different historians are going to say some different things. So take a look at some of the books about Wilson, and they will they'll attribute it to different things, depending upon which historian you read. Jenkins, thanks for joining us twice. Just curious, based on yesterday's class on the flu, did it play any part in the treaty meetings?
And yeah. Maybe this may have to be our last question for time, but yeah. Go, take it away.
Absolutely. It did. Some people actually think that Woodrow Wilson might have had the flu, that was part of the problem in and of itself. So you do take out some key players, and there are all sorts of other ramifications. I'm going to answer one more quick question talking about the Great Depression. Economic ramifications and things along that line certainly happen. This was a question asked yesterday. Were there flu economic repercussions as we see some of these with COVID? They were integrated, but someone asked a really good question. Did the Treaty of Versailles cause the Great Depression? Not necessarily. There are a variety of things that do lead to it, but one of the big things in some ways is the push to move to planting corn and planting things that could actually be easily shipped. That makes a geographic and an environmental change inside, helps to shift that within the United States. And that has some really major impacts in the Dust Bowl and some of these other pieces. So there's a lot more you can explore. Go to our website, theworldwar.org. Wish we could answer more of these really great questions. They are delightful, but we look forward to some more opportunities over the summer.
Absolutely. And Laura, thank you again for joining us twice, 2 days in a row, back to back. This is wonderful. And I certainly hope we have opportunities to continue these conversations between the National World War I Museum and Memorial and the National World War II Museum. So Thank you, Laura, and thanks to everybody who attended today. We will get any additional questions that you posted answered offline, and this will be accessible to watch again on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.